Welcome to the world of Aora, a news and lore podcast about the Pillars of Eternity games, as well as Obsidian Entertainment's upcoming release, Avowed. Hello, fellow Kith, and welcome to the world of Aora, a news and lore podcast about the Pillars of Eternity games and Obsidian Entertainment's upcoming game, Avowed. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. I would first just like to thank you guys so much for joining me on today's episode. We've been recently going through the history of the Dyrwood, which is the setting for the first Pillars of Eternity game. So these episodes are largely for the Pillars of Eternity nerds out there who really are into the game and want to learn more about the setting, want to learn about the history of the world that you're playing in. But as well, as I've discussed in previous episodes, there is some precedent that Avowed could also be taking place in the Dyrwood as well. And so it would be useful for us to know ahead of time what this setting is like and what we can expect. As well, maybe we'll understand some Easter eggs they throw into the game. That being said, we still technically don't know where Avowed will be taking place. So, we'll take that with a grain of salt for now. But in the meantime, it's good to learn more, it's good to know more, and speculate. I have been going through a 6-part in-game lore book. So there's this book in the game of Pillars of Eternity. There's a series of books in the Pillars of Eternity game called The History of the Dyrwood. And I have gone through 4 parts, and today we are going to be doing part 5, The Proliferation of Animancy. Now, in order to give an understanding for what Animancy is, I did an entire episode where we discuss what Animancy actually is. So if you're just tuning into this episode as your first foray into this podcast, first thing, welcome. Thank you so much for joining in. I hope you like the lore that is in this show and that it's well done. But I would highly recommend pausing here, going back to the episode before this and listening to it, unless you already know what Animancy is. To give a very quick summary, Animancy is an academic field of study. It's a science, and it primarily studies a thing called essence, capital E essence. Essence is the building blocks of the soul. Your body is made up of carbon. Your soul in Aora is made up of essence. That's the short version of it. And so Animancy is about studying that essence and its properties, how to manipulate it, how to measure it, quantify it, etc., etc. It's essentially what Animancy does, and it gets really interesting. So, anyways, that's all you need to know as a foundation for this episode. There shouldn't be any spoilers because we're reading from a book that you can get in-game anywhere. So yeah, we'll dive right into it.
I'm curious. What exactly did you find there?
So as I said, I'm going to be reading straight out of the lore book that you can find in the game called The Dyrwood, Part 5, The Proliferation of Animancy. And if we get through this quick enough, I might even have time to get to the last and final part, which is Part 6. Although, as you can imagine, that kind of has some meaty history to it, so we'll see what we get through. This is the reading of this book, and I will stop and add commentary as we go. Animancy, outlawed while under a Dyr rule, was technically no longer taboo after Hadrit's Rebellion. Hadrit's Rebellion is something that we talked about in the Dyrwood Part 4, Hadrit's Rebellion. Essentially, Admeth Hadrit was in charge of the Dyrwood, which was a colony of a Dyr, and he achieved independence for the Dyrwood, making it its own nation. Hadrit's Rebellion culminated with the War of Defiance, where they finally achieved their peace after a conflict with their mother nation, the Aedir Empire. Academics began its study again in earnest in 2681, studying being Animancy. By 2697, there were almost 40 academics actively researching the field of Animancy, both in the Dyrwood and the Vailian Republics. The Vailian Republics is a area south of the Dyrwood, which is kind of a colony for Old Valia, a different empire of the world. So you have Aedir being one empire, and then you have this other great empire, Old Valia, or Grand Valia, depending on who you're talking to. Aedir came to this new continent called the Eastern Reach, and they set up the Dyrwood. The Vailians of Grand Valia came to this new continent of the Eastern Reach, and they set up the Vailian Republics. Returning back to the book, there were 40 academics actively researching the field, both in the Dyrwood and the Vailian Republics, even though no significant results had been discovered. A tragic breakthrough of sorts happened in 2704 AI, so that is only 23 years after the academics began studying Animancy. An animancer working in Balereach, which is one of the earldoms of the Dyrwood, accidentally shattered the souls of about a dozen volunteers who had been helping him. In retaliation for the deaths, the citizens of the area stormed his house and killed him. So there was a group of volunteers that was working for this one animancer out in Balereach, and in his experiments, he, as it describes here, shattered their souls. And I'm not sure what that means or how that would look or how the word shattered applies there, but tragic event nonetheless. The Earl of the region, not wanting to waste resources or anger the locals any more than they already were, did nothing to find the head of the vigilante mob, but neither did he outlaw animancy. So this is kind of a tough situation for the Earl of this area, is the people are angry, understandably so, because a lot of their loved ones may have died here. And they're also a little bit freaked out by animancy. Animancy is one of those things where it's like, you're doing scientific experimentation on the soul. How is that okay? Like there's probably a lot of tension about that already. So the Earl is like, well, I want to stop this vigilante mob, but it's kind of too big that if like I go against it, that's not going to be good for me. It's not going to look good. I'll have that to deal with. But also he doesn't want to outlaw animancy either, because that would, I think he doesn't want to make a decision on which side of the fence he's going to be on. So he just stays out of it. Downside, then, that means that these animancers, well, this one animancer anyways, does not have safety anymore. Like he's not going to have the protection of the Earl. And likely other animancers are also going to be targeted pretty soon, because everyone's upset at this one guy for what he did, and it's not going to take long for them to say, well, why don't we just get all of the animancers and go put their head on a pike? They're going to do something. Getting back to the book, to ensure their own safety, most animancers moved from the rural areas where they were studying and settled in Defiance Bay. Defiance Bay is the major city of the Dyrwood, many of them choosing the emerging and wealthy district of Brackenbury as their new home of operations. And actually, they would set up their sanitarium there, which is kind of the main hub of academic research and experimentation, and where they also try to help people out who are undergoing soul maladies, since animancers are dealing with the soul. While there were still a few breakthroughs and the study of animancy continued for the next 24 years, it quickly slowed as it became cost prohibitive and complicated the more people learned about it. Most animancers couldn't afford to continue research without the support of donations or gifts from the wealthy individuals and organizations. In 2737, which is 33 years after that tragic event we talked about earlier, some animancers, desperate to continue their studies and seeing no other means of furthering their research, entered the forbidden ruins of Airglanfath to further their research. Now, to back up a second, if you haven't listened to the previous episodes on the Dyrwood's history, Airglanfath is the region that the local native tribes of this continent live in. So you have the area known as the Dyrwood, and that's where the Aedir Empire colonized their location. It was the Dyrwood. Then you have Valian Republics, which is where Grand Valia and Old Valia colonized there. But there is another region, Airglanfath, which is mainly populated by the native peoples that were already living there. These people are referred to as the Glanfathans. When the Dyrwoodans showed up, they started plundering these ancient sites, a long-aged civilization known as the Ingwithans. The thing is these sites were considered holy to the Glanfathans, and so plundering them for loot and knowledge and whatnot was causing a lot of conflict. To gloss over a lot of history, there was a couple of wars that broke out because of these tensions, not to mention the Dyrwoodans were taking the Glanfathans as slaves. There was a lot of conflict over this. Eventually, peace was achieved, and then the Dyrwood also achieved independence. And part of this peace and independence is that they were going to respect these ancient ruins that the Glanfathans considered holy and sacred. And so entering into these forbidden ruins is a big deal. Like, if this happens enough, if enough people in the Dyrwood start doing this again, it could spark another war between the Dyrwoodans and the Glanfathans. They, that is the Animancers, discovered some such sites had strange artifacts that seemed to bear affinity to soul essence, and began to prod at the devices for further insight. So they were discovering that this ancient society were also masters of animancy. They had clearly had old relics of things they used for animancy experiments, or things that were used that the animancers of today are using normally. Even with continued research, they are unable to tell quite what they have discovered. Eventually, they were found out by the Glanfathans, who captured some of them, demanding they be punished for their crimes. The Dyrwoodan authorities, in order to maintain their treaties and keep peace, had no choice. They allowed the Animancers to be executed according to Glonfathan tradition. This led to the Duke to make an additional proclamation. The study and practice of animancy on or even near the sacred Glonfathan sites would be punishable by death. So we can see the tensions around animancy increasing in the Dyrwood. It's already something that the people are a little bit nervous about. And then we have an experiment that goes horribly wrong, causing them to flee to the cities. And then animancy gets too expensive to be able to continue research, so they start taking matters into their own hands and going into ruins and holy sites of Glonfathans. And now it's threatening the peace of the nation. And so the government, the Duke, the leader of the Dyrwood, is essentially having to make the proclamation that you're not allowed to go into these holy sites anymore or you will die. That is how dire the situation is. So animancy is not really on good terms here. And I should clarify too that in the Aedir Empire, across the ocean where they originally came from, animancy is already outlawed. And it's been outlawed for over 100 years. It's been outlawed in that empire alone. So animancy's kind of got a raw deal going on here. People are not a fan of it in general. In 2780, in order to solidify relations again with the Glonfathans, the Dyrwoodan government allowed some animancers to begin training. In 2780, in order to solidify relations again with the Glonfathans, the Dyrwoodan government allowed some animancers to begin training and experiments in conjunction with the Glonfathan mind hunters, their native ciphers. So this is really cool. This is a good idea and quite interesting. We have all this conflict that's going on between the Dyrwoods and the Glonfathans, and then you have these people that are threatening to break the peace of these two factions by going into these holy sites. And as a thing of peace, both factions agree to begin working together, both in animancy and in cipher magic. So for those not familiar with Pillars of Eternity, there is a class that you can play called Cipher. The Cipher is someone who has a natural ability or is able to use another person's essence, their soul energy, as the source for their magic. And so quite often they can read minds. They could perceive souls around them. They could look into the soul of another person. And that's why the Glonfathans called them mind hunters. In their native tongue, I think they're called Brishalgwyn. Little extra tidbit there for you. But this is a really interesting thing going on where they're starting to work together, and that peace and that trade of ideas is starting to happen with the Glonfathans and Dyrwoods. This was an exchange of information. The Animancers documented the secrets of the mind hunters' powers. The mind hunters learned new techniques for concentration, which assisted them in taking their powers to a level no Glonfathan had seen before. So they're able to help each other out. This is awesome. The ciphers, no longer wary of the Animancers' intentions, trusted them to such a level that they convinced the Glonfathans to give some Animancers limited access to some of the training sites where the Glonfathans practiced. And so here we see that this partnership has actually become so fruitful that they're actually allowing these Animancers now to enter into some of these areas that they were no longer allowed into before. This is a really big step. If Dyrwood was represented by a person and Eir Glonfath was represented by a person, what we are seeing here is not only them agreeing to have peace together and then start to work together on a project, but actually the source of their conflict is becoming softened now. The one person who was not wanting this person to steal their stuff or, take their things or do stuff that was upsetting them, they're actually inviting them back into that space to continue working together. So they're really starting to partner. This is good to see, at least in my opinion. The Amenfaths of the Glonfathan tribes, which are the leaders of the tribes, opened the training grounds to the Animancers. They were not allowed inside, as this was still strictly forbidden. But the general allowances by the Glonfathans were seen as a breakthrough in relations between the Dyrwood and Eir Glonfath. Over the next 8 years, the Animancers' research would continue unimpeded. With the exception of some minor squabbles, there has been no major strife between the two groups for almost 120 years since. And so that is the Dyrwood Part 5, The Proliferation of Animancy. And there we have the history of animancy in the Dyrwood and how it went through some troubling times, but ended up kind of coming back up again. We still don't know how the people think of animancy. And if you play Pillars of Eternity 1, you actually get to see a lot of that story unfold in the game's narrative. A lot of the themes in Pillars of Eternity centers around animancy. It's a really big part of the dialogue. So if you're interested in this topic at all, I highly suggest playing Pillars of Eternity 1 in particular, because Again, like I said, a lot of the narrative discusses animancy, and there's a lot of political issues that come up from it, and there's a lot of things to think about in terms of what do you think is right and wrong, and your character may or may not get involved in a lot of that. So if you're interested, highly recommend playing that game. All right, so the good news is that we got through the Dyrwood Part 5 really quickly, and I don't want to end the episode this early, so I'm actually going to dive into the next and final book of the Dyrwood's history, which is the Dyrwood Part 6, The Saints' War and Waidwen's Legacy. To give a little bit of context, the Saints' War we'll talk about in the book. Waidwen is the name of a person, and Waidwen is a big deal because he apparently was inhabited by one of the gods of Eora and basically caused the Saints' War. And a thing called Waidwen's Legacy is what brought forth something known as the Hollowborn Crisis, where people were born without a soul. At least that's what they're calling it. They're calling it Waidwen's Legacy, and that's what they're attributing it to. There's a lot there. Let's just get into the book, and I'll clear up some of the stuff as we go. In 2807, war returned to the Dyrwood. Saint Waidwen, transformed supposedly into a living incarnation of Aethys, marched on the Dyrwood from Rhaed Saris, beginning the Saints' War. Right there, we have a whole bunch of stuff and many words that some of us may or may not know if you've got into the game enough or haven't even played it. So, first off, we're in the 2800s, and Pillars of Eternity is played in the 2800s, so this is getting pretty close to the time where you can actually play the game. There is a man who is named Saint Waidwen, and he is from Rhaed Saris, which is another colony to the north. So it's out of the Dyrwood area. It's its own area, Rhaed Saris. And that is where a lot of Aethasians live. It's kind of a theocracy out there. Aethys is one of the 11 gods that you find in the Pillars of Eternity world. He is the god of dusk and dawn, the god of light and redemption, and is the main patron deity for Rhaed Saris, where Saint Waidwen comes from. Now, supposedly, Aethys, the deity, inhabited Saint Waidwen's body, and so Saint Waidwen was kind of a conduit or a vessel for this entire god, and then this god-man person marched with him and his army from Rhaed Saris to the Dyrwood and began what's known as the Saints' War. The Dyrwood rallied at Halgot Citadel and took the battle to him in Rhaed Saris, attempting to prevent as much damage to their own land as they could. Even though there were devastating losses for the Dyrwoodan forces, using Hadrit's military techniques combined with Galvin Red's strategies, they were able to secure a few victories for themselves as well. Now, if you've been following along through all of these pieces of history of the Dyrwood, a couple of names right there are going to stand out, and it's going to make it a little more impactful for you when you hear what I just said. We've talked in the past about how Admeth Hadrit, the leader of the Dyrwood, the Duke of the Dyrwood, has great military prowess, just like his father. He was able to assume leadership of the Dyrwood and very quickly were able to defeat the Glanfathans when they were at war with each other, even though his dad couldn't succeed that well. And Galvin Red, which is one of the Glanfathan military leaders, who I believe we read in an earlier book is now dead, he was also a great military strategist, and so the Glanfathans are using his strategies as well. Now you have both of these people working together, Admeth Hadrit, and you have both of these people working together. Wait, did we already discuss if Admeth Hadrit died? Yes, sorry, I misspoke. Admeth Hadrit has also already died. He died in the War of Defiance back when the nation was achieving its independence. So, anyways, what I'm trying to say here is that the militaries of both of these factions are working together, using the techniques taught by these great military commanders to defeat the Rhaed Sarans. And yet, they're still trying to just hold them off and push them back and be able to do damage for them. And that tells you just how powerful the Rhaed Saran force is, that these two great military factions are working together, and yet they're still having to put up quite the fight. So they're up against a formidable foe. I mean, theoretically, if one of them is inhabited by a god, that's kind of understandable. Rhaed Saran forces made their way into the Dyrwood through White March, which is an area of snow-covered mountains, which is kind of between Rhaed Saris and the Dyrwood, unopposed by the locals at Cold Morn, one of the locations within the White March, leaving Mercy Vale burned and devastated, also another location. The contempt the Dyrwoodans have for Cold Morn for this betrayal lasts well after the war ends. So, essentially, these Rhaed Sarans are going to go marching through the White March to hit the Dyrwood and attack them militarily, obviously. They walk through a town called Cold Morn, and Cold Morn does not oppose them. which the Dyrwoodan people see as a act of treason, basically. That these people allowed this military to just walk on through, right? So that would be the equivalent of you have a city with walls all around it, and this military is trying to get through the front door, and it's not working. So a whole bunch of this army that's trying to besiege the city goes into a back entrance, and you have a bunch of guards there, or just even regular citizens, and they see this happening. They don't even close the gate. They just stand by and let them walk in. You know, that is the kind of equivalent of what the people at Cold Morn did, at least in the views of the Dyrwoodans. Desperate to end the war and eliminate Saint Waidwen, the Megronic clergy of Dyrwood developed a special bomb that was hidden beneath the bridge at Halgot's citadel. So, Megronic clergy refers to the god Magron, Magron being the goddess of fire and war, who, I believe, if I remember correctly, opposes Aethys on a level of ideals and virtue. They developed a special bomb, which would have to be special if St. Waidwen really is inhabited by a god. Going back to the book, the Megronic clergy developed a special bomb that's hidden beneath the bridge at Halgot's citadel, intending to lure Waidwen to the bridge and then detonate it. Their ploy succeeded, and St. Waidwen was completely destroyed, along with most of the forces with him and the entire bridge. The 12 Dyrwoodan men and women who volunteered to delay St. Waidwen on the bridge were also lost, their sacrifice and martyrdom celebrated by the Dyrwood in the ensuing years. And so the 12 Dyrwoodans that volunteered to, I think they also built the bomb, but then also hold him there while the bomb was detonated. They're very revered in this society. But you learn a little bit of history about them too as you play the game. But the more important detail that I think we need to focus on is the part where it says that St. Waidwen was completely destroyed. And that makes you wonder, is it just the body of St. Waidwen that was destroyed? Or was it St. Waidwen and Aethys, the god, that was inside of it? As you play Pillars of Eternity 1, the narrative of the story discusses this idea of, was Waidwen the god actually killed or not actually killed? A lot of people believe that Aethys, the god, has been killed by normal Kith creatures when they blew up St. Waidwen on the bridge using this bomb. And so that's something that kind of comes up in discussion and opens up a really interesting idea for debate within that society, or even in our own, to talk about, like, if something like that could ever occur in that kind of world, what would that mean, right? What does it mean that these Kith people were able to develop a weapon, theoretically, that could kill a god? You know, that's a big deal. And it's something that we can't really do justice in just a small conversation. The bomb would come to be known as the Godhammer, and soon after the battle, the citadel was renamed Godhammer Citadel. St. Waidwen's forces were easily routed after his death, and the Dyrwoodans set about rebuilding from the first major conflict in over a century. One thing I want to point out here is that as we are gearing up for Avowed, if you notice that anything in any of the reveal trailers or any information that is leaked refers to a thing called Halgot Citadel and not Godhammer Citadel, might indicate that we are playing Avowed before this occurs. Just a little thing to keep your eyes out for. So getting back to the book, what happened is they essentially, after they destroyed St. Waidwen, you cut the head off the snake, the rest of it didn't go so well for the rest of the Raidsand army. In retaliation for St. Waidwen's action on Aethys' part, many Aethasian followers were purged from Dyrwoodan communities or driven out via social pressure. As you could imagine, there's this man who everyone believes to be inhabited by Aethys. And everything that we know in the game kind of points to that being true as well, by the way, that he really was inhabited by Aethys. So as you can imagine, the people of the Dyrwood are not a fan of Aethys or his followers. And the Aethasian faith was actually quite prominent in Dyrwood. People were openly worshipping this god. It's odd, too, because this god is typically, I think, related to one of the more, quote-unquote, good gods, So now a lot of these Aethasian followers are being killed or driven out. And so it's a really tense time to be an Aethasian follower, which is interesting. I know for me, I've looked at all 11 gods of Eora, and I feel like if I was to pick one god that I would be following if I lived in this world, I probably would have picked Aethys. Not that you pick a god. That's such a weird idea to me, but that's aside from the point. So I'd have to hide my worship if I was in the Dyrwood and following that god. Anyways, back to the book. Less than a year after the devastation of the Saints' War, tragedy hit again. In 2809, so that is only 2 years after the war started, the first Hollowborn was reported in the Dyrwood. A Hollowborn is exactly what it sounds like. It is a person, a kith person, who is born without a soul, and so they are hollow. Many of these poor creatures died within weeks or months of being born. The outcry from the populace calls for blame or punishment be leveled against someone, whether it be the gods, the mothers, the government, or the Aethasian followers. So as you can imagine, all these people are kind of against Aethys. This is a very recent war, and there's a lot of hatred towards the people who follow Aethys and the god themselves. And all of a sudden, Hollowborn starts to be a thing that happens all the time. People are born without a soul. The thing that people attribute it to is Aethys. So they killed Aethys in St. Waidwen, and now all of a sudden, Hollowbirths are occurring. So people are speculating that this is a punishment from the gods for destroying one of their own, or this is a result of us killing Aethys because he was somehow instrumental in souls being implanted into bodies. And, there's a whole bunch of speculation happening, and people are looking for someone to blame, right? So it's very easy to blame the Aethasian followers, or even the gods themselves, or even the government or the mothers for some reason. The people are scared and they're looking for somebody to blame. This crisis, which actually it ends up being called the Hollowborn crisis, it continues on, and it actually becomes one of the main narrative forces of Pillars of Eternity 1. Responding to the great socio-political pressure to try and help the Hollowborn, Animancers developed a process to transplant animal souls into the infants that they might develop survival instincts and even a basic personality. So what happens if you're born without a soul is you're basically just catatonic. You're just this empty vessel. You just merely exist. The soul is kind of like the battery for what makes you a person, in a sense, And so the idea that these Animancers had was, well, if you take an animal soul and put it into one of us kith creatures, it'll at least give us a battery to be operating with, The process, going back to the book, the process seemed successful. So it was repeated on tens of thousands of Hollowborn, even though many Animancers disagreed with the technique, worried about the ethical implications. These protests were largely ignored and discounted. It was working and people were wanting a solution, right? So that makes sense. The process was soon named Salvation, and the Hollowborn given souls this way were called the Saved. So interestingly enough, these Animancers are taking the souls of animals and putting them into kith creatures who are born without a soul, and they are actually coming to life. They're actually developing survival instincts and even have a basic personality, as they say. So it was a success, which I find interesting, but, whatever, that's what happened. But if you continue reading in the book, 5 years after the first Hollowborn, an Orlan girl, is saved, she entered puberty. In a matter of mere weeks, she transformed into a ravenous, feral creature devoid of all conscience. Soon, all of the saved would experience the same fate. Each one, upon reaching puberty, would transform into what the locals called wicts, which means uncontrollable children. And so if you think back to what we were just talking about, that the process was successful, or so it seemed, so they repeated it on tens of thousands of Hollowborn children. So you now have either at this one time tens of thousands of children entering into puberty and becoming these wicts, which are these grotesque kind of feral looking creatures, but they have the shape of kith children. It's very unnerving. Can you imagine that? Could you imagine that you are trying to go through a Dyrwoodan forest and you're being wary of the monsters that can exist out there, and one of the terrifying creatures you can come across is a feral child, essentially, that will attack you and rip you to shreds. That is some next level horrific stuff, Obsidian, but good fantasy writing, at least in my opinion. But yes, so anyways, tens of thousands of these Hollowborn are either all at once becoming this way because they did it at the same time, or they're just gradually going to have more and more. And that's a hard thing to deal with too. If they recognize that this is happening to these Hollowborn that you've implanted these souls in, what do you do now, right? What do you do now with the remaining kids that aren't about to hit puberty? How do you handle that? What do you do with them, right? There's an ethical battle there that I don't want to discuss right here on this podcast, but it's still that's something that as a society they would have to deal with. After researching the problem, Animancers discovered an incompatibility between the animal souls and the children's bodies. This fueled the parents' anger, as many of them had to kill their wicked children. Oof. The animancers responsible were widely denounced, and many of them were dragged from their homes, beaten, and in many cases killed. Most surviving animancers left the rural areas en masse and headed to Defiance Bay. Others left the area completely, moving to the Valian republics to study in peace. And that is how we conclude the reading of this book. The animancers, yet again, not having the blessing of the people, being dragged out of their homes, beaten and killed, people moving away to safe places to research, or moving away entirely to research somewhere else, maybe even start a new life. That is where the history of the Dyrwood ends, is more conflict between Animancy and the people in the context of a Hollowborn crisis, where if you have a child that you give birth to, you don't know if it's going to be born with a soul. And that is the historical setting for Pillars of Eternity 1. Congratulations. If you play Pillars of Eternity 1 now, you know the entire history, or at least relative history, of the Dyrwood, the place that you're going to be playing in. You now understand the historical and social context for what you are walking into. And in Pillars of Eternity 1, you're playing a character that's kind of coming in as an immigrant, or you're coming in from a place that isn't the Dyrwood. And so you're walking into this as a foreigner. It's a really cool way to set the foundation for a good story. And Pillars of Eternity does a good job, in my opinion, of weaving a lot of these narratives, especially the more recent history parts, into the main narrative of the game. And if CRPGs are your thing and you haven't played Pillars of Eternity, or if you're interested in CRPGs, again, I'm doing this podcast, so this isn't going to surprise you, but I highly encourage you to play this game just for understanding what the world is like, so that when Avowed comes out, you understand it, or just to play it for a good game that has a good story and good writing. If you've already played the game, awesome. I hope you liked it, and I hope that this maybe revealed some things about the lore that you didn't know about before, some little details. I hope this series has been fun for you. But with that said, that is everything I have to say for today's episode. That is the entire history of the Dyrwood done over a few parts, and so now I'm going to move into the next episode where we look at the Dyrwood and more of its culture. I feel like if we do just the history and then leave it there, that's kind of incomplete. I think it'd be good to stop and say, okay, so who are the Dyrwoodans? What is their society like? What is their culture like? Et cetera, et cetera. So we'll do an episode on that for sure before we dive into a new topic down the road. All right, so that's it for today's episode. Thank you for listening. It's been fun going through the history of this setting for Pillars of Eternity, and it's really making me want to go back and do another character. So maybe I'm going to do that. Any recommendations for weird builds you think I should try? I surprisingly actually haven't played through Pillars of Eternity dozens of times, like I think some people might expect. I've actually only done it a handful of times, but when I play the game, I tend to do absolutely everything. And I like goof build runs. I once did one in Pillars of Eternity 2 where it was all rangers and they were all chanters so that I could have as many summons as possible. I haven't finished that one though. I should go back to that. Anyways, I'm getting sidetracked. I wanted to take a moment and say thank you to everybody for listening to this podcast and also for reaching out and connecting with me in the past weeks, especially while I was gone over the summer. I received a few emails from people and we talked at length about the game and the podcast and whatnot. You've heard me talk about before. I actually want to stop and give a shout out to people specifically for emails that they sent me. And, and I've reached out to them and asked them for their permission. I want to read out some of the things that people said. And so I have one email from Braden Knott, I believe, if that's how the name is pronounced. He refers to me as Dear Mr. Ginger. So thank you for that, Braden. You wrote an email to me talking about his experience playing Pillars of Eternity and how he's been a fan for years. His experience going through the game the first time and replaying it at a slower pace and getting into the Dyrwood. And he says, when he heard the Deadfire was coming out, and let me read this for you. When I heard the Deadfire was coming out, I was barely able to contain my excitement. When it was released, I just about speedran it, finishing the main game in about 20 hours. And I read that and I was like, whoa, because I am a slow gamer. I play games very slowly, on part because I like to take my time and look at the stuff, but also because I'm just slow AF. Like, I'm not a fast gamer. If I tried to do speed runs, I would be in a contest for like who's the slowest speedrunner who's actually trying to speedrun. So finishing the Deadfire game in 20 hours to me was like, wow, that is a speedrun to me. I'm sure if you really actually tried to, like if it was your first playthrough, like he said it was his first playthrough and he just went right through it. It's 20 hours. That's really good time for a blind run of a game like that, especially one that has a lot of reading and you want to really pay attention to. Kudos to you, Braden. And it continues on to, we talk about the podcast and about Pillars of Eternity. I'm not going to read the entire email just because, conversation is between two people, but still, thank you, Braden, for sending that email. The next one is from Jason Locke. He says, "Hi, Eric. I just want to take a moment to say how much I'm enjoying your podcast." Thank you, Jason. I think it's a shame that Pillars of Eternity lore doesn't get the same level of love as, say, the Elder Scrolls or Dragon Age. I agree because I love the Pillars of Eternity lore, clearly. It doesn't get the same level of love. And I think that's just because of an accessibility thing. A lot of people look at a CRPG and they're just like, I'm not touching that. That is not my thing. And I was in that boat for a very long time, so I understand that. But yeah, there's a lot of cool lore in all of these games, and sometimes it's a shame that we don't see it. I wonder quite often how many things I'm missing from not playing games just because the aesthetic or the style turns me off, So like, I wonder what kind of things I'm missing. Anyways, goes on to talk about the internship that I was in over the summer, and actually mentions that he hopes that I can do an episode on Animancy. And I did, Jason. I hope that the episode I did before this was to your liking. By the way, anyone out there, if you're interested in a particular lore subject, let me know, because I decide week by week what episodes I'm going to do, what topics I'm going to do. I particularly try to focus on letting people excited about Avowed know what the world is like who haven't been involved in the games. So that's what I try to gear towards. But like, I'm also doing this for us Pillars of Eternity nerds out there. So if there's stuff that you want to know more about or just hear an episode on, let me know. Thank you, Jason, for writing me that email. The most recent one I got was from Robert White. He titled it, "I Love and Hate You," which at first I thought was going to be him saying, "I love this podcast. Thank you for it. Also, I hate you because you spoiled a big thing about the game for me." That's what I thought it was going to be about. And so I had a mild panic attack of, oh no, what have I done? But no, Robert goes on to say that he found the podcast and he loves it because he thinks it's amazing and it makes me giddy learning about the lore of the world of Eora and such. Thank you, Robert. That was such a wind in my sails moment to read that. And he says, "You hate me because you're playing Mass Effect and now all you want to do is replay the old Pillars of Eternity games when you just literally finished them." I 100% understand that. He and I talked about Mass Effect because I've been wanting to play that so bad, but I just haven't spent the money on it because I played the original trilogy. So I'm kind of like, I don't want to drop $90 Canadian on a game that I've already played, but it's also not the game that I played, So no, so that was good. Thank you, Robert, for sending an email. Thank you guys for reaching out to me on other platforms as well while I was gone over the summer. It was really uplifting and encouraging. I really appreciated it. And I love the conversations that ensue afterwards. So if anyone out there has anything they want to reach out and chat about, whether it's a question about the show or about the game or requests or criticisms or comments, I'm happy to receive criticisms because I want to make this show better for you guys. If there's anything out there you guys want to reach out for, you can reach me by sending me an email, worldofaora@gmail.com, or you can find me on Twitter @worldofaora. Anyways, I've gone on long enough. This outro has gone on way longer than I thought it would. Thank you all for joining me on today's episode of The World of Eora. Join me next time as we discuss the Dyrwood society and its government and its culture. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thank you guys so much for joining, and I'll see you next time.